13. Silo 18. Walker found himself shoved down the square stairs, past a crew of mechanics working to weld another set of steel plates across the narrow passage. He had most of the home-built radio in a spare parts tub, which he desperately clutched with 2 hands. He watched the electrical components rattle together as he jostled through the crowd of mechanics fleeing from the attack above. In front of him, Shirley carried the rest of the radio gear against her chest, the antenna wires trailing behind her. Walker skipped and danced on his old legs so he wouldn't get tangled up. "Go, go, go!" someone yelled. Everyone was pushing and shoving. The rattle of gunfire seemed to grow louder behind him, while a golden shower of fizzling sparks rained through the air and peppered Walker's face. He squinted and stormed through the glowing hail as a team of miners in striped coveralls fought their way up from the next landing with another large sheet of steel. "This way!" Shirley yelled, tugging him along. At the next level, she pulled him aside. His poor legs struggled to keep up with the running others. A duffel bag was dropped. A young man with a gun spun and hurried back for it. "The generator room," Shirley told him, pointing. There was already a stream of people moving through the double doors. Jenkins was there, managing the traffic. Some of those with rifles took up position near an oil pump, the counterweighted head sitting perfectly still like it had already succumbed to the looming battle. "What is that?" Jenkins asked as they approached the door. He jerked his chin at the bundle of wires in Shirley's arms. "Is that—" "The radio, sir," she nodded. "Fat lot of good it does us now." Jenkins waved 2 other people inside. Shirley and Walker pressed themselves out of the way. "Sir?" "Get him inside," Jenkins barked, referring to Walker. "I don't need him getting in the way." "But, sir, I think you're going to want to hear—" "Come on, go!" Jenkins yelled to the stragglers, bringing up the rear. He twirled his arm at the elbow for them to hurry. Only the mechanics who had traded their wrenches for guns remained. They formed up like they were used to this game, arms propped on railings, long steel barrels trained the same direction. "In or out?" Jenkins told Shirley, starting to close the door. "Go," she told Walker, letting out a deep breath. "Let's get inside." Walker numbly obeyed, thinking all the while of the parts and tools he should have grabbed, things a few levels overhead now that were lost to him, maybe for good. "Hey, get these people out of the control room!" Shirley ran across the generator room as soon as they were inside, wires trailing behind her, bits of rigid aluminum antenna bouncing across the floor. "Out!" A mixed group of mechanics and a few people wearing the yellow of supply sheepishly filed out of the small control room. They joined the others around a railing that cordoned off the mighty machine that dominated the cavernous facility and gave the room its name. At least the noise was tolerable. Shirley imagined all those people being stuck down here in the days when the roar of the rattling shaft and loose engine mounts could deafen a person. "All of you, out of my control room!" She waved the last few out. Shirley knew why Jenkins had sealed off this floor. The only power they had left was the literal kind. She waved the last man out of the small room studded with sensitive knobs, dials, and readouts, and immediately checked the fuel levels. Both tanks were topped up, so they had at least planned that properly. They would have a few weeks of power, if nothing else. She looked over all the other knobs and dials, the jumble of cords still held tightly against her chest.
"Where should I—"
Walker held his box out. The only flat surfaces in the room were covered with switches and the sorts of things one didn't want to bump. He seemed to understand that. On the floor, I guess?" She set her load down and moved to shut the door. The people she'd hurried outside gazed longingly through the window at the few tall stools in the climate-controlled space. Shirley ignored them. "Do we have everything? Is it all here?" Walker pulled pieces of the radio out of the box, tisking his tongue at the twisted wires and jumbled components.
"Do we have power?"
he asked, holding up the plug of a transformer. Shirley laughed. "Walk, you do know where you are right now, right? Of course we have power." She took the cord and plugged it into one of the feeds on the main panel. "Do we have everything? Can we get it up and running again? Walk, we need to let Jenkins hear what we heard."
"I know."
He bobbed his head and sorted the gear, twisting some loose wires together as he went.
"We need to string that out."
He jerked his head at the tangled antenna in her arms. Shirley looked up. There were no rafters.
"Hang it from the railing out there," he told her. "Straight line. Make sure that end reaches back in here."
She moved toward the door, trailing the loops out behind her.
"Oh, and don't let the metal bits touch the railing," Walker called after her.
Shirley recruited a few mechanics from her work shift to help out. Once they saw what needed doing, they took over, coordinating as a team to undo the knots while she went back to Walker. "It'll just be a minute," she told him, shutting the door behind her, the wire fitting easily between it and the padded jamb.
"I think we're good,"
he said. He looked up at her, his eyes sagging, his hair a mess, sweat glistening in his white beard.
"Oh, shit,"
he said. He slapped his forehead.
"We don't have speakers."
Shirley felt her heart drop to hear Walker cuss, thinking they'd forgotten something crucial. "Oh, wait here," she told him, running back out and to the earmuff station. She picked one of the sets with a dangling cord, the kind used to talk between the control room and anyone working on the primary or secondary generators. She jogged past the curious and frightened-looking crowd to the control room. It occurred to her that she should be more afraid like they were, that a real war was grinding closer to them, but all she could think about were the voices that war had interrupted. Her curiosity was much stronger than her fear. It's how she'd always been. "Well, how about these?" She shut the door behind herself and showed him the headphones.
"Perfect,"
he said, his eyes wide with surprise. Before she could complain, he snipped the jack off with his multi-tool and began stripping wires.
"Good thing it's quiet in here," he said, laughing.
Shirley laughed as well, and it made her wonder what the hell was going on. What were they going to do? Sit in there and fiddle with wires while the deputies and the security people from IT came and dragged them away? Walker got the cones wired in, and a faint hiss of static leaked out of them. Shirley hurried over to join him. She sat down and held his wrist to steady his hand. The earphones trembled in them.
"You might have to."
He showed her the knob with the white marks he'd painted on. Shirley nodded and realized they'd forgotten to grab the paint. She held the dial and studied the various ticks. "Which one?" she asked.
"No."
He stopped her as she began dialing back toward one of the voices they'd found.
"The other way. I need to see how many—"
He coughed into his fist.
"We need to see how many there are."
She nodded and turned the knob gradually toward the black, unpainted portion. The two of them held their breath, the hum of the main generator barely audible through the thick door and double-paned glass. Shirley studied Walker while she spun the dial. She wondered what would become of him when they were rounded up. Would they all be put to cleaning? Or could he and a few of the others claim to be bystanders? It made her sad, thinking what had been wrought of their anger, their thirst for revenge. She thought of how things could have gone so differently, how they'd had all these dreams, unrealistic perhaps, of a real change in power, an easy fix to impossible and intractable problems.
"A little faster,"
Walker said, growing impatient with the silence. They'd heard a few hits of crackling static, but no one talking. Shirley very slightly increased the rate she spun the knob. You think the antenna? She started to ask. Walker raised his hand. The little speakers in his lap had popped. He jerked his thumb to the side, telling her to go back. Shirley did. She tried to remember about how far she had gone since the sound, using a lot of the same skills she'd learned in that very room to adjust the previously noisy generator.
Solo? This is Juliet. Can you hear me? What's going on up there?
Shirley dropped the knob. She watched it swing on its soldered wire and crash to the floor. Her hands felt numb. Her fingertips tingled. She turned, gaped at Walker's lap where the ghostly voice had risen, and found him looking dumbly down at his own hands. Neither of them moved. The voice, the name, they were unmistakable. Tears of confused joy winked past Walker's beard and fell into his lap. "14. Silo 17. Juliet grabbed the limp air hose with both hands and squeezed. Her reward was a few weak bubbles rolling up her visor. The pressure inside the tube was gone. She whispered a curse, tilted her chin against the radio, and called Solo's name. Something had happened to the compressor. He was probably working on it, maybe topping up the fuel. She told him not to turn it off for that. He wouldn't know what to do, wouldn't be able to restart it. She hadn't thought this through clearly at all. She was an impossible distance from breathable air, from any hope of survival. She took a tentative breath. She had what was trapped in the suit and the air that remained in the hose. How much of the air in the hose could she suck with just the power of her lungs? She didn't think it would be much, but she didn't know. She took one last look at the large sump pump, her hasty wiring job, the loose trail of wires streaming through the water that she'd hoped to have time to secure against vibration and accidental tugs. None of it likely mattered anymore, not for her. She kicked away from the pump and waved her arms through the water, wading through the viscous fluid that seemed to both impede her while giving her nothing to push or pull against. The weights were holding her back. Juliet bent to release them and found she couldn't. The buoyancy of her arms, the stiffness of the suit. She groped for the Velcro straps, but watched her fingers through the magnified view of the helmet and water as they waved, inches from the blasted things. She took a deep breath, sweat dripping from her nose and splattering the inside of her dome. She tried again and came close, her fingertips nearly brushing the black straps, both hands outstretched, grunting and throwing her shoulders into the simple act of reaching her damned shins. But she couldn't. She gave up and shuffled a few more steps down the hallway, following the wire and hose, both visible in the faint cone of white light emanating from above her head. She tried not to bump the wire, thinking of what one accidental pull might do, how tenuous the connection was that she'd made to the pump's ground. Even as she struggled for a deep breath, her mind was ever playing the mechanic. She cursed herself for not taking longer to prepare. Her knife! She remembered her knife and stopped dragging her feet. It slid out of its homemade sheath sewn across her belly and gleamed in the glow from her flashlight. Juliet bent down and used the extra reach of the blade. She slid the point of the knife between her suit and one of the straps. The water was dark and thick all around her. With the limited amount of light from her helmet, and being at the bottom of mechanical under all that heap of flood, she felt more remote and alone, more afraid than she had in all her life. She gripped the knife, terrified of what dropping it could mean, and bobbed up and down, using her stomach muscles. It was like doing sit-ups while standing. She attacked the strap with a labored sawing motion, cursed in her helmet from the effort, the strain, the pain in her abdomen from lurching forward, from throwing her head down, when finally the exercise weight popped free. Her calf felt suddenly naked and light as the round hunk of iron clanged mutely to the plate steel flooring. Juliet tilted to the side, held down by one leg, the other trying to rise up. She worked the knife carefully beneath the second strap, fearful of cutting her suit and seeing a stream of precious bubbles leak out. With desperate force, she shoved and pulled the blade against the black webbing, just like before. Nylon threads popped in her magnified vision, sweat spattered her helmet, the knife burst through the fabric, the weight was free. Juliet screamed as her boots flew up behind her, rising above her head. She twisted her torso and waved her arms as much as she could, but her helmet slammed into the runs of pipes at the top of the hallway. There was a bang, and the water all around her went black. She fumbled for her flashlight to turn it back on, but it wasn't there. Something bumped her arm in the darkness. She fumbled for the object with one hand, knife in the other, felt it spill through her gloved fingers, and then it was gone. While she struggled to put the knife away, her only source of light tumbled, invisible, to the ground below. Juliet heard nothing but her rapid breathing. She was going to die like this, pinned to the ceiling, another bloated body in these corridors. It was as if she were destined to perish in one of these suits, one way or another. She kicked against the pipes and tried to wiggle free. Which way had she been going? Where was she facing? The pitch black was absolute. She couldn't even see her own arms in front of her. It was worse than being blind. It was some new ability to see the nothingness, to know her eyes were working but somehow taking nothing in. It heightened her panic, even as the air in her suit seemed to grow more and more stale. The air. She reached for her collar and found the hose, could just barely feel it through her gloves. Juliet began to gather it in, hand over hand, like pulling a mining bucket up a deep shaft. It felt like miles of it went through her hands. The slack gathered around her like knotted noodles, bumping and sliding against her. Juliet's breathing began to sound more and more desperate. She was panicking. How much of her shallow breathing was coming from the adrenaline, the fear? How much because she was using up all her precious air? She had a sudden terror that the hose she was pulling had been cut, that it had been sawn through on the stairwell, that the free end would at any moment slip through her fingers, that her next frantic reach for more of the lifeline would result in a fistful of inky water and nothing else. But then she grabbed a length of hose with tension, with life, a stiff line that held no air but led the way out. Juliet cried out in her helmet and reached forward to grab another handhold. She pulled herself, her helmet bumping against a pipe and bouncing her away from the ceiling. She kept reaching, lunging one hand forward in the black to where the line should be, finding it, grasping, yanking, hauling herself through the midnight soup of the drowned and the dead, wondering how far she'd get before she joined them and breathed her very last. Silo 18. Lucas sat with his mother on the thick jamb of the open server room door. He looked down at her hands, both of them wrapped around one of his. She let go with one of them and picked a piece of lint off his shoulder, then cast the offending knot of string away from her precious son.
"And you say there'll be a promotion in this?"
she asked, smoothing the shoulder of his undershirt. Lucas nodded. "A pretty big one, yeah." He looked past her to where Bernard and Sheriff Billings were standing in the hallway, talking in low voices. Bernard had his hands tucked inside the stretched belly of his coveralls. Billings looked down and inspected his gun.
"Well, that's great, sweetheart. It makes it easier to bear you being away."
"It won't be for much longer, I don't think."
"Will you be able to vote? I can't believe my boy is doing such important things."
Lucas turned to her. Vote? I thought the election was put off. She shook her head. Her face seemed more wrinkled than it had a month ago, her hair whiter. Lucas wondered if that were possible in so brief a time.
"Oh, it's back on,"
she said.
"This nasty business with those rebels is supposed to be just about over."
Lucas glanced toward Bernard and the sheriff. I'm sure they'll figure out a way to let me vote, he told his mother.
"Well, that's nice. I like to think I raised you proper."
She cleared her throat into her fist, then returned it to the back of his hand.
"And they're feeding you? With the rationing, I mean?"
Oh, more than I can eat. Her eyes widened.
"So I suppose there'll be some sort of a raise?"
He shrugged. I'm not sure. I'd think so. And look, you'll be taken care of.
"Me?"
She pressed her hand to her chest, her voice high.
"Oh, don't you worry about me."
You know I do. Hey, look, Ma, I think our time's up. He nodded down the hallway. Bernard and Peter were heading toward them. It looks like I've got to get back to work.
"Oh, well, of course."
She smoothed the front of her red coveralls and allowed Lucas to help her get to her feet. She puckered her lips and he presented his cheek.
"My little boy,"
she said, kissing him noisily and squeezing his arm. She stepped back and gazed up at him with pride.
"You take good care of yourself."
I will, Ma.
"Make sure you get plenty of exercise."
Ma, I will. Bernard stopped by their side, smiling at the exchange. Lucas's mother turned and looked the silo's acting mayor up and down. She reached out and patted Bernard on his chest.
"Thank you,"
she said, her voice cracking.
Oh, it's been great to meet you, Mrs. Kyle.
Bernard took her hand and gestured toward Peter.
The sheriff here will see you out.
"Oh, of course."
She turned one last time and waved at Lucas. He felt a little embarrassed, but waved back.
Sweet lady,
Bernard said, watching them go.
She reminds me of my mother.
He turned to Lucas.
Are you ready?
Lucas felt like voicing his reluctance, his hesitation. He felt like saying, I suppose. But he straightened his back instead, rubbed his damp palms together and dipped his chin. Absolutely, he managed, feigning a confidence he didn't feel.
Great. Let's go make this official.
He squeezed Lucas's shoulder before heading into the server room. Lucas walked around the edge of the thick door and leaned into it, slowly sealing himself in as the fat hinges groaned shut. The electric locks engaged automatically, thumping into the jamb. The security panel beeped, its happy green light flicking over to the menacing red eye of a sentry. Lucas took a deep breath and picked his way through the servers. He tried not to go the same way as Bernard, tried never to go the same way twice. He chose a longer route just to break the monotony, to have one less routine in that prison. Bernard had the back of the server open by the time he arrived. He held the familiar headphones out to Lucas. Lucas accepted them and put them on backwards, the microphone snaking around the rear of his neck. Like this? Bernard laughed at him and twirled his finger.
Other way around,
he said, lifting his voice so Lucas could hear through the muffs. Lucas fumbled with the headphones, tangling his arm in the cord. Bernard waited patiently.
Are you ready?
Bernard asked, once they were in place. He held the loose jack in one hand. Lucas nodded. He watched Bernard turn and aim the plug at the banks of receptacles. He pictured Bernard's hand swinging down and to the right, slamming the plug home into number 17, then turning and confronting Lucas about his favorite pastime, his secret crush. But his boss's small hand never wavered. It clicked into place. Lucas knowing exactly how that felt, how the receptacle hugged the plug tightly, seemed to welcome it in, the pads of one's fingers getting a jolt from the flicking of that spring-loaded plastic retainer. The light above the jack started blinking. A familiar buzzing throbbed in Lucas's ears. He waited for her voice, for Juliet to answer. A click.
Name?
A trill of fear ran up Lucas's back, bumps erupting across his arms. The voice, deep and hollow, impatient and aloof, came and went like the glimpse of a star. Lucas licked his lips. "Lucas Kyle," he said, trying not to stammer. There was a pause. He imagined someone, somewhere, writing this down or flipping through files or doing something awful with the information. The temperature behind the server soared. Bernard was smiling at him, oblivious to the silence on his end.
"You shadowed in IT."
It felt like a statement, but Lucas nodded and answered. "Yes, sir." He wiped his palm across his forehead and then the seat of his coveralls. He desperately wanted to sit down, to lean back against server number 40, to relax, but Bernard was smiling at him, his mustache lifting, his eyes wide behind his glasses.
"What is your primary duty to the silo?"
Bernard had prepped him on likely questions. "To maintain the order?" Silence. No feedback. No sense if he was right or wrong.
"What do you protect above all?"
The voice was flat, and yet powerfully serious. Dire and somehow calm. Lucas felt his mouth go dry. "Life and legacy," he recited. But it felt wrong, this rote facade of knowledge. He wanted to go into detail, to let this voice, like a strong and sober father, understand that he knew why this was important. He wasn't dumb. He had more to say than memorized facts.
"What does it take to protect these things we hold so dear?"
He paused. "It takes sacrifice," Lucas whispered. He thought of Juliet, and the calm demeanor he was projecting for Bernard nearly crumbled. There were some things he wasn't sure about, things he didn't understand. This was one of them. It felt like a lie, his answer. He wasn't sure the sacrifice was worth it. The danger so great that they had to let people, good people, go to their...
"How much time have you had in the suit labs?"
The voice had changed, relaxed somewhat. Lucas wondered if the ceremony was over. Was that it? Had he passed? He blew out his held breath, hoping the microphone didn't pick it up, and tried to relax. "Not much, sir. Bernard, my boss, he's wanting me to schedule time in the labs after, you know." He looked to Bernard, who was pinching one side of his glasses and watching him.
"Yes, I do know. How is that problem in your lower levels going?"
Well, I'm only kept apprised of the overall progress, and it sounds good." He cleared his throat and thought of all the sounds of gunfire and violence he'd heard through the radio in the room below.
"That is, it sounds like progress is being made, that it won't be much longer."
A long pause. Lucas forced himself to breathe deeply, to smile at Bernard.
"Would you have done anything differently, Lucas, from the beginning?"
Lucas felt his body sway, his knees go a little numb. He was back on that conference table, black steel pressed against his cheek, a line from his eye extending through a small cross, through a tiny hole, pointing like a laser at a small woman with gray hair and a bomb in her hand. Bullets were flying down that line. His bullets.
No, sir," he finally said. "It was all by the order, sir. Everything's under control."
He waited. Somewhere, he felt, his measure was being taken. You are next in line for the control and operation of Silo 18, the voice intoned. Oh, thank you, sir. Lucas reached for the headphones, was preparing to take them off and hand them to Bernard in case he needed to say something, to hear that it was official. Do you know the worst part of my job? The hollow voice asked. Lucas dropped his hands. What's that, sir? Standing here, looking at a silo on this map and drawing a red cross through it. Can you imagine what that feels like? Lucas shook his head. I can't, sir. It feels like a parent losing thousands of children all at once. A pause. You will have to be cruel to your children to not lose them. Lucas thought of his father. Yes, sir. Welcome to Operation 50 of the World Order, Lucas Kyle. Now, if you have a question or two, I have the time to answer, but briefly. Lucas wanted to say that he had no questions. He wanted to get off the line. He wanted to call and speak with Juliet, to feel a puff of sanity breathed into this crazy and suffocating room. But he remembered what Bernard had taught him about admitting ignorance, how this was the key to knowledge. Just one, sir, and I've been told it isn't important, and I understand why that's true, but I believe it will make my job here easier if I know. He paused for a response, but the voice seemed to be waiting for him to get to the question. Lucas cleared his throat. Is there? He pinched the mic and moved it closer to his lips, glanced at Bernard. How did all this begin? He wasn't sure. It could have been a fan on the server whirring to life, but he thought he heard the man with the deep voice sigh. How badly do you wish to know? Lucas feared answering the question honestly. It isn't crucial, he said, but I would appreciate a sense of what we're accomplishing, what we survived. It feels like it gives us a purpose, you know? The reason is the purpose, the man said cryptically. Before I tell you, I'd like to hear what you think. Lucas swallowed. What I think? Everyone has ideas. Are you suggesting you don't? A hint of humor could be heard in that hollow voice. I think it was something we saw coming, Lucas said. He watched Bernard, who frowned and looked away. That's one possibility. Bernard removed his glasses and began wiping them on the sleeve of his undershirt, his eyes at his feet. Consider this. The deep voice paused. What if I told you that there were only 50 silos in all the world, and that here we are in this infinitely small corner of it? Lucas thought about this. It felt like another test. I would say that we were the only ones. He almost said that they were the only ones with the resources, but he'd seen enough in the legacy to know this wasn't true. Many parts of the world had buildings rising above their hills. Many more could have been prepared. I'd say we were the only ones who knew, Lucas suggested. Very good. And why might that be? He hated this. He didn't want to puzzle it out. He just wanted to be told. And then, like a cable splicing together, like electricity zipping through connections for the very first time, the truth hit him. It's because... He tried to make sense of this answer in his head, tried to imagine that such an idea could possibly verge on truth. It's not because we knew, Lucas said, sucking in a gasp of air. It's because we did it. Yes, the voice said. And now you know. He said something else, just barely audible, like it was being said to someone else. Our time is up, Lucas Kyle. Congratulations on your assignment. The headphones were sticky against his head, his face clammy with sweat. Thank you, he managed. Oh, and Lucas? Yes, sir? Going forward, I suggest you concentrate on what's beneath your feet. No more of this business with the stars, okay, son? We know where most of them are. "16. Silo 18.
Hello? Solo? Please say something.
There was no mistaking that voice, even through the small speakers in the dismantled headset. It echoed bodiless in the control room, the same control room that had housed that very voice for so many years. The location was what nailed it for Shirley. She stared at the tiny speakers spliced into the magical radio, knowing it could be no one else. Neither she nor Walker dared breathe. They waited what felt like forever before she finally broke the silence.
"That was Juliet," she whispered. "How can we... Is her voice trapped down here? In the air? How long ago would that have been?"
Shirley didn't understand how any of the science worked. It was all beyond her pay grade. Walker continued to stare at the headset, unmoving, not saying a word, tears shining in his beard. "Are these ripples we're grabbing with the antenna, are they just bouncing around down here?" She wondered if the same was true of all the voices they'd heard. Maybe they were simply picking up conversations from the past. Was that possible? Like some kind of electrical echo? Somehow this seemed far less shocking than the alternative. Walker turned to her, a strange expression on his face. His mouth hung partway open, but there was a curl at the edges of his lips, a curl that began to rise.
"It doesn't work like that,"
he said. The curl transformed into a smile.
"This is now. This is happening."
He grabbed Shirley's arm.
"You heard it too, didn't you? I'm not crazy. That really was her, wasn't it? She's alive. She made it."
"No." Shirley shook her head. "Walk, what are you saying? That Juliet's alive? Made it where?"
"You heard."
He pointed to the radio.
"Before, the conversations, the cleaning, there's more of them out there. More of us. She's with them, Shirley. This is happening right now."
"Alive?" Shirley stared at the radio, processing this. Her friend was still, somewhere, still breathing. It had been so solid in her head, this vision of Juliet's body just over the hills, lying in silent repose, the wind flecking away at her. And now she was picturing her moving, breathing, talking into a radio somewhere. "Well, can we talk to her?" she asked. She knew it was a dumb question, but Walker seemed to startle, his old limbs jumping.
"Oh, God, yes!"
He set the mishmash of components down on the floor, his hands trembling, but with what Shirley now read as excitement. The fear in both of them was gone, drained from the room, the rest of the world beyond that small space fading to meaninglessness. Walker dug into the parts bin. He dumped some dash of components down on the floor, his hands trembling, but with what Shirley now read as excitement. The fear in both of them was gone, drained from the room, the rest of the world beyond that small space fading to meaninglessness. Walker dug into the parts bin. He dumped some tools out and pawed into the bottom of the container.
"No,"
he said. He turned and scanned the parts on the ground.
No.
"What is it?" Shirley slid away from the string of components so he could better see. "What are we missing? There's a microphone right there." She pointed to the partially disassembled headphones.
"Transmitter, it's a little board. I think it's on my workbench."
"I swiped everything into the bin." Her voice was high and tense. She moved toward the plastic bucket.
"My other workbench, it wasn't needed. All Jenks wanted was to listen in."
He waved at the radio.
"I did what he wanted. How could I have known I'd need to transmit?"
You couldn't, Shirley said. She rested her hand on his arm. She could tell he was heading toward a bad place. She had seen him go there often enough, knew he had shortcuts he could take to get there in no time. Is there anything in here we can use? Think, Wak. Concentrate. He shook his head, wagging his finger at the headphones.
This mic is dumb. It just passes the sound through. Little membranes vibrating.
He turned and looked at her.
Wait. There is something.
Down here? Where?
The mining storehouse would have them. A transmitter.
He pretended to hold a box and twist a switch.
For the blasting caps, I repaired one just a month ago. It would work.
Shirley rose to her feet. I'll go get it, she said. You stay here.
But the stairwell.
I'll be safe. I'm going down, not up. He bobbed his head. Don't change anything with that. She pointed to the radio. No looking for more voices, just hers. Leave it there.
Well, of course.
Shirley bent down and squeezed his shoulder. I'll be right back. Outside, she found dozens of faces turning her way, frightened and questioning looks in their wide eyes, their slack mouths. She felt like shouting over the hum of the generator that Juliet was alive, that they weren't alone, that other people lived and breathed in the forbidden outside. She wanted to, but she didn't have the time. She hurried to the rail and found Courtney. Hey. Everything okay in there? Courtney asked. Yeah, fine. Do me a favor, will you? Keep an eye on Walker for me. Courtney nodded. Where are you? But Shirley was already gone, running to the main door. She squeezed through a group huddled in the entranceway. Jenkins was outside with Harper. They stopped talking as she hurried past. Hey. Jenkins seized her arm. Where the hell are you going? Mine storeroom? She twisted her arm out of his grasp. I won't be long. You won't be going. We're about to blow that stairwell. These idiots are falling right into our hands. Your what? The stairwell, Harper repeated. It's rigged to blow once they get down there and start working their way through. He put his hands together in a ball, then expanded the sphere in a mock explosion. You don't understand. She faced Jenkins. It's for the radio. He frowned. Walk had his chance. We're picking up a lot of chatter, she told him. He needs this one piece. I'll be right back, swear. Jenkins looked to Harper. How long before we do this? 5 minutes, sir. His chin moved back and forth almost imperceptibly. You've got 4, he said to Shirley, but make sure. She didn't hear the rest. Her boots were already pounding the steel, carrying her toward the stairwell. She flew past the oil rig with its sad and lowered head, past the row of confused and twitching men, their guns all pointing the way. She hit the top of the steps and slid around the corner. Someone half a flight up yelled an alarm. Shirley caught a glimpse of 2 miners with sticks of TNT before she skipped down the flight of stairs. At the next level, she turned and headed for the mine shaft. The hallways were silent, just her panting and the clop, clop, clop of her boots. Juliet, alive! A person sent to cleaning, alive! She turned down the next hallway and ran past the apartments for the deep workers, the miners and the oil men who now bore guns instead of holes in the earth, who wielded weapons rather than tools. And this new knowledge, this impossible bit of news, this secret, it made the fighting seem surreal, petty. How could anyone fight if there were places to go beyond these walls? If her friend was still out there, shouldn't they be going as well? She made it to the storeroom, probably been 2 minutes. Her heart was racing. Surely Jenkins wouldn't do anything to that stairway until she got back. She moved down the shelves, peering in the bins and drawers. She knew what the thing looked like. There should be several of them floating about. Oh, where were they? She checked the lockers, threw the dingy coveralls hanging inside them to the ground, tossed work helmets out of the way. She didn't see anything. How much time did she have? She tried the small foreman's office next, throwing the door open and storming to the desk. Nothing in the drawers. Nothing on the shelves mounted to the wall. One of the big drawers on the bottom was stuck, locked. Shirley stepped back and kicked the front of the metal drawer with her boot. She slammed the steel toe into it once, twice. The lip curled down away from the drawer above. She reached in, yanked the flimsy lock off its lip, and the warped drawer opened with a groan. Explosives. Sticks of dynamite. There were a few small relays that she knew went into the sticks to ignite them. Beneath these, she found 3 of the transmitters Walker was looking for. Shirley grabbed 2 of them, a few relays, and put them all in her pocket. She took 2 sticks of the dynamite, just because they were there and went with everything else, and ran out of the office, through the storeroom, back toward the stairs. She had used up too much time. Her chest felt cool and empty, raspy as she labored to breathe. She ran as fast as she could, concentrating on throwing her boots forward, lunging for more floor, gobbling it up. Turning at the end of the hall, she again thought about how ridiculous this fighting was. It was hard to remember why it had begun. Knox was gone, so was McLean. Would their people be fighting if these great leaders were still around? Would they have done something different long ago? Something more sane? She cursed the folly of it all as she reached the stairs. Surely it had been 5 minutes. She waited for a blast to ring out above her, to deafen her with the concussive ferocity trapped in that stairwell. Leaping up 2 treads at a time, she made the turn at the top and saw that the miners were gone. Anxious eyes peered at her over homemade barrels. "Go!" someone yelled, waving their arms to the side, hurrying her along. Shirley focused on Jenkins, who crouched down with his own rifle, Harper by his side. She nearly tripped over the wires leading away from the stairwell as she ran toward the 2 men. "Now!" Jenkins yelled. Someone threw a switch. The ground lurched and buckled beneath Shirley's feet, sending her sprawling. She landed hard on the steel floor, her chin grazing the diamond plating, the dynamite nearly flying from her hands. Her ears were still ringing as she got to her knees. Men were moving behind the railing, guns popping into the bank of smoke leaking from a new maw of twisted and jagged steel. The screams of the distant wounded could be heard on the other side. While men fought, Shirley patted her pockets, fished inside for the transmitters. And again, the noise of war seemed to fade, to become insignificant. She hurried through the door to the generator room, back to Walker, her lip bleeding, her mind on more important things. Silo 17. Juliet pulled herself through the cold, dark waters, bumping blindly against the ceiling, a wall, no way to tell which. She gathered the limp air hose with blind and desperate lunges, no idea how fast she was going, until she crashed into the stairs. Her nose crunched against the inside of her helmet, and the darkness was momentarily shouldered aside by a flash of light. She floated, dazed, the air hose drifting from her hands. Juliet groped for the precious line as her senses gradually returned. She hit something with her glove, grabbed it, and was about to pull herself along when she realized it was the smaller power line. She let go and swept her arms in the blind murk, her boots bumping against something. It was impossible to know top from bottom. She began to feel turned around, dizzy, disoriented. A rigid surface pressed against her. She decided she must be floating up, away from the hose. She kicked off what she assumed was the ceiling and swam in the direction that she hoped was down. Her arms tangled in something. She felt it across her padded chest. She found it with her hands, expecting the power cord, but was rewarded with the spongy nothingness of the empty air tube. It no longer offered her air, but it did lead the way out. Pulling one direction gathered slack, so she tried the other way. The hose went taut. She pulled herself into the stairs again, bounced away with a grunt, and kept gathering line. The hose led up and around the corner, and she found herself pulling, reaching out an arm to fend off the blind assaults from walls, ceilings, steps, bumping and floating up 6 flights, a battle for every inch, a struggle that seemed to take forever. By the time she reached the top, she was out of breath and panting. And then she realized she wasn't out of breath, she was out of air. She had burned through whatever remained in the suit. Hundreds of feet of exhausted hose lay invisible behind her, sucked dry. She tried the radio again as she pulled herself through the corridor, her suit rising slowly toward the ceiling, not nearly as buoyant as before.
Solo, can you hear me?
The thought of how much water still lay above her, all those levels of it pressing down, hundreds of feet of solid flood, it was suffocating. What did she have left in the suit? Minutes? How long would it take to swim or float to the top of the stairwell? Much, much longer. There were probably oxygen bottles down one of those pitch-black hallways, but how would she find them? This wasn't her home. She didn't have time to look. All she had was a mad drive to reach the stairwell, to race to the surface. She pulled and kicked her way around the last corner and into the main hallway, her muscles screaming from being used in new ways, from fighting the stiff and bulky suit, the viscous atmosphere, when she realized the inky water had lightened to something nearer charcoal instead of pitch black. There was a green tint to her blindness. Juliet scissored her legs and gathered in the tubing, bumping along the ceiling, sensing the security station and stairwell ahead. She had traveled corridors like these thousands of times, twice in utter darkness, when main breakers had failed. She remembered staggering through hallways just like this, telling coworkers it would be okay, to just stay still, she'd handle it. Now she tried to do the same for herself, to lie and say it would all be okay, to just keep moving, don't panic. The dizziness began to set in as she reached the security gate. The water ahead glowed lime green and looked so inviting, an end to the blind scrambling, no more of her helmet bumping into what she couldn't see. Her arm briefly tangled with the power cord. She shook it free and hauled herself toward that tall column of water ahead, that flooded straw, that sunken stairway. Before she got there, she had her first spasm, like a hiccup, a violent and automatic gasp for air. She lost her grip on the line and felt her chest nearly burst from the effort of breathing. The temptation to shed her helmet and take a deep inhalation of water overpowered her. Something in her mind insisted she could breathe the stuff. Just give her a chance, it said. One lungful of the water, anything other than the toxins she had exhaled into her suit, a suit designed to keep such things out. Her throat spasmed again, and she started coughing in her helmet as she pulled her way into the stairwell. The rope was there, held down by the wrench. She swam for it, knowing it was too late. As she yanked down, she felt the slack coming. The loose end of the rope spiraled in sinking knots toward her. She drifted slowly toward the surface, very little of the built-up pressure inside her suit. No quick ride to the top. Another throat spasm, and the helmet had to come off. She was getting dizzy. Would soon pass out. Juliet fumbled for the clasps on her metal collar. The sense of déjà vu was overpowering. Only this time, she wasn't thinking clearly. She remembered the soup, the fetid smell, crawling out of the dark walk-in. She remembered the knife. Patting her chest, she felt the handle sticking out from its sheath. Some of her other tools had wiggled out of their pockets. They dangled from lines meant to keep them from getting lost, lines that now just made them a nuisance, turned them into more weights holding her down. She rose gently up the stairwell, her body shivering from the cold and convulsing from the absence of breathable air. Forgetting all reason, all sense of where she was, she became singularly aware of the noxious fog hanging all around her head, trapped by that dome, killing her. She aimed the blade into the first latch in her collar and pressed hard. There was a click and a fine spray of cold water against her neck. A feeble bubble lurched out of her suit and tumbled up her visor. Groping for the other latch, she shoved the knife into it, and the helmet popped off, water flooding over her face, filling her suit, shocking her with the numbing cold and dragging her, sinking, back down to where she'd come from. The freezing cold jolted Juliet to her senses. She blinked her lids against the sting of the green water and saw the knife in her hands, the dome of her helmet spinning through the murk like a bubble heading in the wrong direction. She was slowly sinking after it. No air in her lungs, hundreds of feet of water pressing down. She jabbed the knife into the wrong pocket on her chest, saw drivers and spanners hanging by their cords from her struggle through the blackness, and kicked toward the hose that still led through 4 levels of water toward the surface. Bubbles of air leaked out of her collar and across her neck, up through her hair. Juliet seized the hose and stopped her plummet, pulled upward, her throat screaming for an intake of air, of water, of anything. The urge to swallow was overpowering. She started to pull herself up when she saw, in the undersides of the steps, a shimmering flash of hope. Trapped bubbles, maybe from her descent. They moved like liquid solder in the hollow undersides of the spiral staircase. Juliet made a noise in her throat, a raw cry of desperation, of effort. She pawed through the water, fighting the sinking of the suit, and grasped the railing of the submerged stairway. Pulling herself up and kicking off of the railing, she made it to the nearest shimmer of bubbles, grabbed the edge of the stairs, and pushed her mouth right up to the metal underside of the step. She inhaled a desperate gasp of air and sucked in a lot of water in the process. She dove her head below the surface and coughed into the water, which brought the burn of fluids invading her nose. She nearly sucked in a lungful of water, felt her heart racing and ready to burst out of her chest, stuck her face back up against the wet, rusty underside of that step, and with her lips pursed and trembling, managed to take in a gentle sip of air. The tiny flashes of light in her vision subsided. She lowered her head and blew out, away from the step, watching the bubbles of her exhalation rise, and then pressed her face close for another taste. Air. She blinked away underwater tears of effort, of frustration, of relief. Peering up the twisted maze of metal steps, many of them moving like flexible mirrors where the trapped air was stirred by her mad gyrations, she saw a pathway like no other. She kicked off and took a few steps at a time, pulling herself hand over hand in the gaps between, drinking tiny bubbles of air out of the several-inch hollow beneath each tread, praising the tight welds where the diamond plate steps had been joined many hundreds of years ago. The steps had been boxed in for strength, to handle the traffic of 1,000,000 impacts of boots, and now they held the gaseous overflow from her descent. Her lips brushed each one, tasting metal and rust, kissing her salvation. The green emergency lights all around her remained steady, so Juliet never noticed the landings drifting past. She just concentrated on taking 5 steps with each breath, 6 steps, a long stretch with hardly any air, another mouthful of water where the bubble was too thin to breathe, a lifetime of rising against the tug of her flooded suit and dangling tools, no thought for stopping and cutting things free, just kick and pull, hand over hand, up the undersides of the steps, a deep and steady pull of air. Suck this shallow step dry, don't exhale into the steps above, easy now. 5 more steps, It was a game, like hop. 5 squares and a leap, don't cheat. Mind the chalk. She was good at this, getting better. And then a foul burn on her lips, the taste of water growing toxic, her head coming up into the underside of a step and breaking through a film of gas stench and slimy oil. Juliet blew out her last breath and coughed, wiping at her face, her head still trapped below the next step. She wheezed and laughed and pushed herself away, banging her head on the sharp steel edge of the stairs. She was free! She briefly bobbed below the surface as she swam around the railing, her eyes burning from the oil and gas floating on top. Splashing loudly, crying for Solo, she made it over the railing. With her padded and shivering knees, she finally found the steps. She'd made it! Clinging to the dry treads above her, neck bent, gasping and wheezing, her legs numb, she tried to cry out that she made it, but it escaped as a whimper. She was cold. She was freezing. Her arms shivered as she pulled herself up the quiet steps. No rattle from the compressor, no arms reaching to assist her. Solo? Solo? She crawled the 6 treads to the landing and rolled onto her back. Some of her tools were caught on the steps below. She crawled the 6 treads to the landing and rolled onto her back. Some of her tools were caught on the steps below, tugging at her where they were tied off to her pockets. Water drained out of her suit and splashed down her neck, pooled by her head, ran into her ears. She turned her head. She needed to get the freezing suit off, and found Solo. He was lying on his side, eyes shut, blood running down his face, some of it already caked dry. Solo? Her hand was a shivering blur as she reached and shook him. What had he done to himself? Hey, wake the fuck up. Her teeth were chattering. She grabbed his shoulder and gave him a violent shake. Solo, I need help. One of his eyes parted a little. He blinked a few times, then bent double and coughed, blood flecking the landing by his face. Help, she said. She fumbled for the zipper at her back, not realizing it was Solo who needed her. Solo coughed into his hand, then rolled over and settled once again to his back. The blood on his head was still flowing from somewhere, fresh tracks trickling across what had dried some time before. Solo, he groaned. Juliet pulled herself closer. She could barely feel her body. He whispered something, his voice a rasp on the edge of silence. Hey! She brought her face close to his, could feel her lips swollen and numb, could still taste the gasoline.
My name...
He coughed a mist of red. One arm lifted from the landing a few inches as if to cover his mouth, but it never had a chance of getting there.
Not my name,
he said again. His head lolled side to side, and Juliet finally realized that he was badly injured. Her mind began to clear enough to see what state he was in. Hold still, she groaned. Solo, I need you to be still. She tried to push herself up, to will herself the strength to move. Solo blinked and looked at her, his eyes glassy, blood tinting the gray in his beard the color crimson.
Not Solo,
he said, his voice straining.
My name's Jimmy.
More coughing. His eyes rolled up into the back of his head.
I don't think...
His eyelids sagged shut, and then he squinted in pain.
Don't think I was...
Stay with me, Juliet said, hot tears cutting down her frozen face.
Don't think I ever was alone,
he whispered, the lines on his face relaxing, his head sagging to the cold steel landing. Silo 18. The pot on the stove bubbled noisily, steam rising off the surface, tiny drops of water leaping to their hissing freedom over the edge. Lucas shook a pinch of tea leaves out of the resealable tin and into the tiny strainer. His hands were shaking as he lowered the little basket into his mug. As he lifted the pot, some water spilled directly on the burner. The drops made spitting sounds and gave off a burnt odor. He watched Bernard out of the corner of his eye as he tilted the boiling water through the leaves. "I just don't understand," he said, holding the mug with both hands, allowing the heat to penetrate his palms. How could you do something like this on purpose?" He shook his head and peered into his mug where a few intrepid shreds of leaf had already gotten free and swam outside the basket. He looked up at Bernard. "And you knew about this? How could you know about this?" Bernard frowned. He rubbed his mustache with one hand, the other resting in the belly of his coveralls.
"I wish I didn't know it," he told Lucas. "And now you see why some facts, some bits of knowledge have to be snuffed out as soon as they form. Curiosity would blow across such embers and burn this silo to the ground."
He looked down at his boots.
"I pieced it together much as you did, just knowing what we have to know to do this job. This is why I chose you, Lucas. You and a few others have some idea what's stored on these servers. You're already prepped for learning more. Can you imagine if you told any of this to someone who wears red or green to work every day?"
Lucas shook his head.
"It's happened before, you know. Silo 10 went down like that. I sat back there."
He pointed toward the small study with the books, the computer, the hissing radio.
"And I listened to it happen. I listened to a colleague's shadow broadcast his insanity to anyone who would listen."
Lucas studied his steeping tea. A handful of leaves swam about on hot currents of darkening water. The rest remained in the grip of the imprisoning basket.
"That's why the radio controls are locked up," he said. "And it's why you are locked up."
Lucas nodded. He'd already suspected as much. "How long were you kept in here?" He glanced up at Bernard and an image flashed in his mind, one of Sheriff Billings inspecting his gun while he visited with his mother. Had they been listening in? Would he have been shot, his mother too, if he'd said anything?
"I spent just over 2 months down here until my caster knew I was ready, that I had accepted and understood everything I'd learned."
He crossed his arms over his belly.
"I really wish you hadn't asked the question, hadn't put it together so soon. It's much better to find out when you're older."
Lucas pursed his lips and nodded. It was strange to talk like this with someone his senior, someone who had known so much more, was so much wiser. He imagined this was the sort of conversation a man had with his father, only not about the planned and carried-out destruction of the entire world. Lucas bent his head and breathed in the smell of the steeping leaves. The mint was like a direct line through the trembling stress, a strike to the calm pleasure center in the deep regions of his brain. He inhaled it and held it, finally letting it out. Bernard crossed to the small stove in the corner of the storeroom and started making his own mug. "How did they do it?" Lucas asked. "To kill so many? Do you know how they did it?" Bernard shrugged. He tapped the tin with one finger, shaking out a precise amount of tea into another basket.
"They might be still doing it for all I know. Nobody talks about how long it's supposed to go on. There's fear that small pockets of survivors might be holed up elsewhere around the globe. Operation 50 is completely pointless if anyone else survives. The population has to be homogeneous.
The man I spoke to, he said we were it. Just the 50 silos.
47, Bernard said. And we are it, as far as we know. It's difficult to imagine anyone else being so well prepared. But there's always a chance. It's only been a few 100 years.
A few 100? Lucas leaned back against the counter. He lifted his tea, but the mint was losing its power to reach him. So hundreds of years ago, we decided...
They.
Bernard filled his mug with still steaming water.
They decided. Don't include yourself. Certainly don't include me.
Okay, they decided to destroy the world. Wipe everything out. Why? Bernard set his mug down on the stove to let it steep. He pulled off his glasses, wiped the steam off them, then pointed them toward the study, toward the wall with the massive shelves of books.
Because of the worst parts of our legacy, that's why. At least that's what I think they would say if they were still alive.
He lowered his voice and muttered.
Which they aren't, thank God.
Lucas shuddered. He still didn't believe anyone would make that decision, no matter what the conditions were like. He thought of the billions of people who supposedly lived beneath the stars all those hundreds of years ago. Nobody could kill so many. How could anyone take that much life for granted? And now we work for them, Lucas spat. He crossed to the sink and pulled the basket out of his mug, set it on the stainless steel to drain. He cautioned a sip, slurping lest it burn him. You tell me not to include us, but we're part of this now.
No.
Bernard walked away from the stove and stood in front of the small map of the world hanging above the dinette.
We weren't any part of what those crazy fucks did. If I had those guys, the men who did this, if I had them in a room with me, I'd kill every last goddamned one of them.
Bernard smacked the map with his palm.
I'd kill them with my bare hands.
Lucas didn't say anything, didn't move.
They didn't give us a chance. That's not what this is.
He waved at the room around them.
These are prisons, cages, not homes, not meant to protect us, but meant to force us, by pain of death, to bring about their vision.
Their vision for what?
For a world when we're too much the same, when we're too tightly invested in each other to waste our time fighting, to waste our resources guarding those same limited resources.
He lifted his mug and took a noisy sip.
That's my theory, at least. From decades of reading. The people who did this, they were in charge of a powerful country that was beginning to crumble. They could see the end, their end, and it scared them suicidal. As the time began to run out, over decades, keep in mind, they figured they had one chance to preserve themselves, to preserve what they saw as their way of life. And so, before they lost the only opportunity they might ever have, they put a plan into motion.
Without anybody knowing? How? Bernard took another sip. He smacked his lips and wiped his mustache.
Who knows? Maybe nobody could believe it anyway. Maybe the reward for secrecy was inclusion. They built other things in factories bigger than you can imagine that nobody knew about. They built bombs in factories like these that I suspect played a part in all this. All without anyone knowing. And there are stories in the legacy about men from a long time ago in a land with great kings, like mayors with many more people to rule. When these men died, elaborate chambers were built below the earth and filled with treasure. It required the work of hundreds of men. Do you know how they kept the locations of these chambers a secret?
Lucas lifted his shoulders. They paid the workers a ton of chits? Bernard laughed. He pinched a stray tea leaf off his tongue.
They didn't have chits. No, they made perfectly sure these men would keep quiet. They killed them.
Their own men? Lucas glanced toward the room with the books, wondering which tin this story was in.
It's not beyond us to kill to keep secrets.
Bernard's face hardened as he said this.
It'll be a part of your job one day, when you take over.
Lucas felt a sharp pain in his gut as the truth of this hit. He caught the first glimmer of what he'd truly signed on for. It made shooting people with rifles seem an honest affair.
We are not the people who made this world, Lucas. But it's up to us to survive it. You need to understand that.
We can't control where we are right now, he mumbled. Just what we do going forward.
Wise words.
Bernard took another sip of tea. Yeah, I'm just beginning to appreciate them. Bernard set his cup in the sink and tucked a hand in the round belly of his coveralls. He stared at Lucas a moment, then looked again to the small map of the world.
Evil men did this, but they're gone. Forget them. Just know this. They locked up their brood as a fucked up form of their own survival. They put us in this game, a game where breaking the rules means we all die, every single one of us. But living by those rules, obeying them, means we all suffer.
He adjusted his glasses and walked over to Lucas, patted him on the shoulder as he went past.
I'm proud of you, son. You're absorbing this much better than I ever did. Now get some rest. Make some room in your head and heart. Tomorrow, more studies.
He headed toward the study, the corridor, the distant ladder. Lucas nodded and remained silent. He waited until Bernard was gone, the muted clang of distant metal telling him that the grate was back in place, before walking through to the study to gaze up at the big schematic, the one with the silos crossed out. He peered at the roof of Silo 1, wondering just who in the hell was in charge of all this, and whether they too could rationalize their actions as having been foisted upon them, as not really being culpable but just going along with something they'd inherited, a crooked game with rat-shit rules and most everyone kept ignorant and locked up. Who the fuck were these people? Could he see himself being one of them? How did Bernard not see that he was one of them?